name is Dr. Chinny. I am an associate professor in enterprise and corporate development, and I currently work at a university in the West Midlands regions of the United Kingdom. In the next few minutes, about 20 minutes or so, my topic would be around moving from management to application. So moving from the talks to sort of applying some of those learning, some of those experiences as a business leader into practice and begin to make tangible impacts within areas of business function for the purpose of unlocking organizational values. So what I've done with this slide is to offer some form of rationale behind my talk. But just before I do that, I'll just provide some insight on my background. I currently lead a number of executive education programs. So what this means is that my students are mainly business leaders, management executives who have particular interest in identifying practical solutions to specific issues in their businesses or within their organization. So as you can see, my background is tailored with what I've got on the slide as my opening thoughts. So it's about enabling or equipping business leaders towards developing those personal and professional competences towards applying business concepts, applying their experience, their years of experience for the purpose of offering practical solutions and contributions, mainly and ultimately for the purpose of unlocking tangible values within their areas of business organizational practice. Right. To be a bit more specific in terms of what I mean from management to application, what the slide presents is specific areas of focus for my presentation. Now, I'll start by assessing business leaders' approach. So my assumption is that whoever is going to listen to my presentation will be someone that works within a business leader or a management executive. So one of my focus area in my presentation is to get a business leader or management executive to assess their approach to decision making towards unlocking organizational value. So the ultimate goal is we want to unlock organizational value. Now, to do that, we've got to question our approach to decision making. The second thing I'm going to be looking at in my presentation in the journey towards unlocking organizational value is for that business leader, for that management executive to review their coalition of support for improvement across different functions, across their organizational dynamics. Remember, we're working towards expanding business growth. Now, in the area of coalition of support, there are a couple of things I'm going to be touching on which include stakeholder engagement and communication strategies. So let's say we start off with my first area of focus, which is getting the business leader or the management executive to assess their approach to decision making. Remember, we're working towards unlocking organizational value. Now, when you talk about organizational value, most times, whether it's within an academic setting or a health sector or a construction environment, whichever business setting you think about, what sits at the center is the client. What sits in the middle is the customer. What sits right at the core of unlocking value, organizational value, is the user. Okay, so it is really, really difficult to talk about unlocking organizational value without taking into consideration what the client needs are. So that is the essence of the slide. So as part of assessing a business leader assessing their approach to decision making, They've got to review, are we taking into consideration the need, the requirements, the expectations of the clients, the requirements of the customer. And in doing that, the needs of the clients are being aligned carefully and properly to the values of that particular organization. Now, moving forward, I will shed a bit more light in terms of what we need to focus on as a business leader or a management executive when we talk about, are we looking at the customer need in alignment to the organizational values. Now, drawing on the previous slide on what I said about what are your customer needs, what are the client expectations, what are the user requirements. And remember, you're asking these questions in alignment to the organizational values. So when you're thinking about customer value or customer value proposition, like I've got on the slide, you're sort of questioning. Remember, we're looking at assessing your approach to decision making. You're questioning, do you have an understanding on what your customer perspectives are? Okay, do you have clarity on what your offerings are? Okay, so this is not a place of assumption. And when I say it is not a place of assumption, you're not assuming that this is what the customer think about your offerings. There's got to be a clear picture on how customers perceive what you offer. How do or how will your customers feel when they use the product? Have you asked? Have you tried to question that? So that should form part of your assessing your approach towards unlocking organizational value, your decision making towards unlocking organizational value. Are your customers happy with the product or your offerings? Okay, so we've got to come to a place of yes, they are, or no, they aren't. And what do we have to do to move them from the place or the position of not being happy to the position of being happy? What changes do you need to make within the core business activities? Remember, as a business leader, you're assessing your approach towards decision making in line with unlocking customer value. So these are the different steps you may want to consider in terms of assessing that approach in decision making towards unlocking organizational value. So moving on, I'm being a little bit more specific, so when I say assessing your approach to decision making towards unlocking organizational value, okay, I've got specifics on the slide. So an example of what you may want to do is you question or you identify an area of priority, an area that you know as an employee within that organization, as a business leader or an executive within that organization. This is definitely an area of priority. This is definitely an area that will contribute immensely in whichever aspects of the business. So your focus, remember, is on locking customer and organizational value. So which means in doing that, and remember we said earlier, you're doing that in alignment with whatever are the objectives or values of your business. Okay, so identify areas of priority. Every business, every sector, every organization has got areas of priority. Okay, so when you identify those areas of priority, maybe you may want to put them according to hierarchy, according to the ones that will have the biggest benefit, according to the ones that will have the huge or the biggest impact, the ones that have the that will be detrimental if they're not taken care of. So that is what we mean by area of priority. Now, having identified an area of priority, let's start with one, and I'll show us an example in a moment. You now begin to define specific, measurable objectives for addressing that area of priority. Okay, I'll give an example as we move on. And then in looking and having identified that area of priority, you're beginning to look at your team. Do we need to reskill? Do we need to bring in talent? What are my personal ambitions around this area of priority? What are the professional aspirations? Now, when I say professional aspirations, it's not just you, because that area of priority has got to be so huge that it's difficult for you to actually achieve it on your own. It would involve the rest of the team. So moving on, I'll explain a bit more what I mean by involving the rest of the team. Okay, I've got an example which will, show up in a little while. An example of an area of what I might call eminent priority or contribution with with an intention that my focus is on the client, on the customer. And remember, I'm working towards unlocking organizational value. But just before I show up that or the example shows up, on the right hand side, I've got some things you may ask yourself as a business leader, as a management executive, in within that area of priority that you have identified, that eminent priority area, that area of contribution, that area you feel that this will definitely unlock value for my business. So you're questioning what is the nature of that area of identification? What is the scope of it? How big would it be in terms of who would it involve? Would it just be, even though it's one team that would require the execution of it, it will dribble down to other members of the organization eventually at whatever stage. And then you're also being very clear on the success criteria. Now, when I say success criteria, I'm simply making reference to what impact that will have within your business. I've got an example of a specific area and I've given it a title. Is an evaluation of the different processes for driving customer satisfaction within ABC. So I've just given an example of a company. What how do we evaluate our processes for the purpose of driving customer satisfaction? Now, our ultimate goal towards unlocking value is improving one organizational structure. So, if we address that area of driving customer satisfaction, that is a priority area, the impact or the success criteria is that it will have a direct positive knock-on effect on the organizational structure, on the job roles, and the service provision. Okay, so you see what I've done. I've identified an area of priority and I've linked that to the values of the organization in terms of areas of improvement, and I've identified three areas of improvement: organizational structure, job values, and service provision. Now, what I have that I've just popped up is simply me bringing back the point I had on the previous slide, where within that area of priority and you're linking it to the values of the organization, you're ensuring that you're also defining targets, things that you would do to address driving customer satisfaction, and you're being very specific in things that you do. They've got to be measurable. So you see how they have a direct improvement towards organizational structure, for example, job roles and service provision. And then, of course, the second point is what I said earlier around, do you need to review what the resources, the skills that you've got within your team? Do you need to bring in talent for the purpose of addressing that area of priority? Cast your mind back to my area of focus for my presentation. The first, which I've talked about, is assessing your approach in decision making towards unlocking organizational value. The second area of focus for my presentation is your review of your coalition of support, for the ultimate purpose of expanding business growth. So there are a couple of things that I'm looking at in terms of coalition of support. The first one is stakeholder engagement strategies, and the second one is communication principles. So taking the first point around coalition of support, which is stakeholder engagement, I think this is quite a very familiar term. Simply put, is which individuals or teams will be involved for you to execute that priority area for the purpose of unlocking organizational value. Which individuals will benefit the most if that priority area is taken into consideration and steps are taken towards execution for the purpose of unlocking organizational value. So there's got to be clarity on the different, the matrix of the different individuals that will be involved in execution of it, as well as the matrix of the different individuals and teams that will benefit the most from it. Now, there are a few more things I want to highlight around stakeholder engagement. What has just popped up on the slide is, it says effective stakeholder relationship. It entails clarity of purpose, like I've said earlier, and of course communication, which I'm going to touch on later. So who and who have have you got to be very clear who needs to work with who, or how will the impact of the success criteria dribble down from one individual to the next. One more thing worth mentioning in the area of having that effective or clear stakeholder relationship is the benefits around it. Things like trust, personal development, and respect. The reason why I've highlighted these points is that as a business leader or management executive, you've got to be clear when you're having to communicate that priority, the need for you to execute that priority area for unlocking business value. You are ensuring that you're demonstrating effective stakeholder relationship, as well as highlighting the benefits around that effective stakeholder relationships. Okay, so still within that, my second area of focus, coalition of support. The first thing we've talked about is stakeholder engagement. The next thing is communication principles. And simply put, I'm drawing on what I've just said in the previous slide around being clear on the different stakeholders, the related stakeholders, and the varied stakeholders. So there's got to be clarity in that. And something I put on the slide, which I usually say in most of my presentation, is the purpose of any good business case or project. Okay, this is a task you're undertaking. Is communication. You've got to be clear in terms of sharing that view or disseminating that information. Okay, so it is quite difficult to talk about stakeholder relationship without bringing in good, clear communication. And you would notice that what has just popped up on the slide is what I had on the previous slide. So this is me reiterating the essence of when you talk about effective stakeholder relationship, you've got to bring in clear communication to ensure that everyone involved or not involved have good understanding of what that priority area is and what benefits in terms of unlocking organizational value it will have for individuals and for the organization as a whole. Okay, so what I've done with this slide is to give you some insights in terms of what you may want to communicate, or when you're having to develop your arguments or things you want to showcase or present to who, as a business leader or as a management executive. There are a number of things I've got on the slide. Okay, so the scope, I've said this earlier, the scope of what you intend to do for the purpose of unlocking value, organizational value, the steps and the timings on when you're going to do what you want to do. Okay, the cost estimate. Every business want to know what the money matters. What is it going to cost us? So this is me highlighting a number of things or a number of factors that you may want to or you should really consider when you're thinking about what to communicate and how to communicate it. Okay, there are a couple of ways that we've got to take into consideration as a business leader when you talk about good communication principles. The first one is internal communication. So this is what goes on within the organization. Okay, how you share the information within the organization. Okay, I'll try not to slavishly read through what I've got on the slide because my understanding is that that is quite clear and easy to understand. Now, the external communication is how, remember, you're thinking about customer or client value proposition. How do externals, how does the public view that area that you're proposing for the purpose of unlocking organizational value? And when I say how do externals view it, things like your online presence, do they pass on the same message? Do they have the same message? Your marketing slogans, the tactics you use for marketing, your branding, What about your vision? What about your mission and your core values? Do they replicate what you're saying in terms of unlocking, you know, organizational value? Have you clearly incorporated the customer need, the client requirement that we said earlier, the customer voice in that area of priority that you're hoping to execute or look into for the purpose of unlocking organizational value? Okay, to bring my presentation to a close, this is my summary slide. So my brief presentation, I'll read through what I've got on the slide. My brief presentation forms part of a comprehensive study that I'm doing on how business leaders or management executives are equipped and how they are supported towards identifying an improvement initiative in their business or areas of business function for the purpose of unlocking value for the organization. Now, what I've done in my presentation is to simply discuss only two of the key steps towards unlocking organizational value. Okay, so the two things I discuss are assessing a business executive assessing their approach to decision making towards unlocking that value, that organizational value. And the second thing I looked at was an introduction into the coalition of support towards expanding business growth. And when I talked about coalition of support, I looked at communication principles and stakeholder engagement. I've got my contact details at the bottom of the slide. And thank you